Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more the executive branch, and yeah, this time we are looking at the impact, the legacy of Madison's presidency. Um, with that said, before we get into the video, I do want to remind you that if you do want to donate to my channel, to support my channel, I have two ways for you to do so. I have a Patreon account, which is a month-to-month monthly donation system, and I have a Coffee account, which can do much the same, but also allows you to make single one-time donations. Links to both will be in the description box below the video. Please, 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 if you are in financial difficulties or donating will put you in financial difficulties, please do not donate. Tough enough out there with the idiots in charge as it is right now. If you can afford it, though, if you're able to and you want to without it causing you severe problems, then thank you. I do appreciate it. Me, myself, and I that make the videos. I do the research, the filming, the editing, the posting, all of it. So yeah. And I've sworn off doing commercials to try to, as a personal objective, to try to keep my channel clean as far as information, not swayed by money in any one direction. And I don't make money via the videos as of yet. With that said, let's jump into this video. As we said, we'll be looking at the Madison presidency. Let's go back here, and this is from the University of Virginia Papers of James Madison. And we want to start here, 1901 to 1909. Served as Secretary of State under Jefferson, and would draft instructions for the Louisiana Purchase and supervise the acquisition of the territory, publish an examination of the British doctrine when subjects to capture a neutral trade not open in time of peace. And then he would become U.S. President. As we said, served Secretary of State under Jefferson. He himself very influential, just not even being president, but everything else he's done. One of the founding fathers, one of the first 5 presidents, one of the Virginia 4, because 4 of the first 5 presidents are from Virginia: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. During his time as president, of course, there was the War of 1812, which during the war, in August of 1814, late in August of 1814, the British occupied and burned Washington, D.C., including the White House and the U.S. Capitol. So not only the White House, home of the president and his staff and other members of the executive branch, the U.S. Capitol building, where the Congress took power, took their seats, and did everything. And then in December of that same year, we would see the Treaty of Ghent finalized. January 1815, the United States would actually defeat the British in New Orleans, Louisiana, led by a young, I'm not sure what rank he was, Andrew Jackson, who himself would become president. But it was kind of a useless victory because the treaty was signed in 1814, and news of the treaty finally reaches D.C. in February of 1815, just because you've got to send everything overseas. Sailing takes quite a while. So, yeah. So this is what we have going on. Um, and then in 1816, he joined the Board of Visitors of Virginia Central College, now known as the University of Virginia. And then after finishing out his second term as president, he retired to Montpelier, or Montpelier. I'm still not quite sure exactly how it's pronounced, but yeah. Spent a lot of time with the University of Virginia after serving, being the member of the University of Virginia Board of Visitors, serving as a rector for the University of Virginia. So yeah, we get to see around the time period of his presidency, he made a lot of impact. And Madison himself, like Jefferson, highly interested in an educated populace. Jefferson is considered like the founding father of the University of Virginia, and Madison is one of the great backers of the university. So, but with that, let's first jump into domestic affairs. This is from the University of Virginia Miller Center. Madison began to form his cabinet. He found that political divisions and a dearth of talent constrained by choices. Powerful political brokers in New York constrained him to accept George Clinton as his vice president during his first term, though Clinton had run simultaneously as president against Madison, picking up a few electoral votes in New York City, or in the state of New York. Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, was Madison's strongest and most competent ally in the cabinet. Madison wanted to nominate him as Secretary of State, but a contingent of Senate Republicans and Federalists opposed the idea. To placate powerful forces in his divided party, he had to settle for Robert Smith to serve as Secretary of State, Jefferson's less than stellar Secretary of Navy. And then Gallatin would remain in the Treasury Department. And the often inebriated Paul Hamilton took Smith's position in the Navy Department. Caesar Rodney stayed on as Attorney General, and with personal connections more extensive than military experience, William Eustis became Secretary of War. Perhaps a president more adept at managing competing egos could have assembled a more competent cabinet, but Madison was stuck with subpar subordinates. Yeah. Even only the fourth president, and there's already bashing parties and ideologies in the young nation. The deficiencies continued into his second term. Republicans had nominated Elbridge Gerry as vice president, or Elbridge Gerry, the man whom gerrymandering is named after. Though capable enough, Gerry was hardly known for steadfastness, and as a Republican in New England, he had little inclination or political motive to take a hard stance on Republican priorities. Indeed, have he may be seen as the first vice presidential pick meant to balance the ticket. In any event, vice presidents had even less involvement in administration affairs during the early republic than they do now, so Gary's long experience in public life contributed little to the cabinet. Madison did find a reason to dismiss Smith, the Secretary of the Navy, and replace him with James Monroe, who would succeed Madison to the presidency. Even so, Monroe spent much of his time quarreling with Secretary of War John Armstrong, an influential but controversial figure, dating to when he had encouraged mutiny in U.S. ranks during the Revolutionary War. Few of the other replacements improved the cabinet much, as several competent but hardly towering figures slipped in and out of the Treasury, War, and Navy departments, which, yes, we saw multiple in and out and in and out. There was a lot back in just replacements in the Madison cabinet. Change in continuity. During Madison's first term, foreign and domestic affairs overlapped in ways that they rarely have since. Indeed, since the outbreak of the war between Britain and France in 1793, foreign relations had consumed the national conversation and driven domestic politics in ways scarcely imaginable now. Yeah, remember, we even today have wars where the impacts are felt on economically, but it's still something overseas. It don't have an effect on us. This war, the War of 1812 that Madison had to guide the nation through, was the last, I believe, yeah, the last time the United States fought a war on home soil. Well, let's say the majority of a war. I'm not sure about the Spanish American or the Mexican American War because, I mean, the border's right there. So I'm sure there was spillover. There was some battles in the U.S., but a lot of it was fought in Mexico as well. So we often think of the Mexican American War. But yeah, the last battle where the majority of it was fought in the U.S. War of 1812. And like I've explained before, we got our butts handed to us. We got our butts handed to us. Even though we fought the same nation in the Revolutionary War to gain our independence, we had so much more support, backing, and other things helping us out in that war. But the War of 1812 was more or less us versus Britain, and we got our butts kicked. Other wartime periods have drawn the nation's attention across seas, but none in such intense manner as the sustained period of time uh, for such a sustained period of time as the early national era. Because, yeah, remember, Britain, France fighting because Napoleon was just running everything overseas, and France was like, "We are taking everything, ha ha!" But of course, the U.S., being a new nation, often saw its sailors captured and what is called impressment, forced to serve for another nation on their ships. Not even slavery would arise as a major domestic wedge until the Missouri crisis several years after Madison's presidency. When Madison had to deal with the issue, it was usually in the international context, such as conducting hostilities against Spanish Florida as a haven for runaway slaves, or enforcing the government's recent prohibition on the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah, while slavery was still allowed in the U.S., you wouldn't bring in no more slaves in from overseas. That was no longer allowed. Madison certainly had a domestic vision of an agrarian U.S. that contrasted with the industrializing and commercial ideas of the Federalists. But at each turn, that vision clashed headlong with international politics, making his domestic and foreign agendas difficult to distinguish. Yeah, again, so much. Our own sailors being forced into service of other nations when the ships are captured, our trade basically seeing similar difficulties, just trade ships taken and say, yeah, we need the goods, we need the money. It's one of those moments in history where everything's just kind of coming to a boom, boom, boom. Even the Second Bank of the United States, Madison's signature domestic attainment, was the product of the War of 1812. The bank's charter had expired in 1812 and its proponents had attempted to renew it, but the anti-bank coalition moved against it and defeated its renewal. Madison had opposed the bank since his nemesis Alexander Hamilton had proposed it during the first Congress. As president, though, Madison found it difficult to wage war without a viable source of loans or credit, which the bank had provided while existing. In 1816, recognizing the bank's utility, Madison supported its recharter and signed it into law. He accepted as constitutional by successive, or he conceded that the bank had become so ingrained in U.S. finances and so long accepted as constitutional by successive Congresses and the citizenry that it had in effect become constitutional by precedent. Despite signing the bank's recharter into law, Madison remained wary of sweeping implied powers in the Constitution. During his presidency, a growing number of congressmen from both parties advocated federal funding for internal improvements, what today would be called infrastructure. improving roads, improving all kinds of systems around the nations that would better serve the citizenry, the infrastructure of a nation. Madison advocated their vision of federal money spent on canals, bridges, and national roads that would link the various parts of the Union, but he insisted that such funding required an amendment to the Constitution. When Congress passed the Internal Improvements Bill without a constitutional amendment, Madison vetoed it just before he left office. He was practical enough to recognize when he needed to bend to events that, but principled enough to stem changes when in his power. So yeah, this is what was written from the Miller Center of the University of Virginia on his domestic affairs, the domestic things he kind of accomplished there. Let's go over, this is also from the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, list of key events as president. In February the 8th, 1809, from the 1808 presidential election, Congress announces the results of the 1808 presidential election, that Jefferson's Secretary of State, Republican Democrat James Madison, emerges victorious. Madison swamps Federalist opponent Charles C. Pinckney in electoral votes 132 to 40 or 122 to 47. Pinckney carries only 5 states, all of them in New England, to Madison's 12 states. March the 1st, 1809, refurbishment of the White House. Congress authorizes $12,000 to refurbish the White House. And then remember, we know in August of 1814, during the War of 1812, the White House and the Capitol are burned. So yeah, March the 4th, 1809, Madison is inaugurated. April 19th, 1809, the Erskine Agreement. After negotiations with British Minister Erskine, Madison issues a proclamation known as the Erskine Agreement, revoking the embargo on Britain effective June 10th. And for his part, Erskine leads Madison to believe that Britain will revoke its orders in council. On March the 25th, however, the American envoy in Britain learns that British Foreign Secretary Canning has cancelled the Erskine Agreement. News reaches Madison 6 weeks later, and Madison rescinds his proclamation establishing trade with Britain and resumes a policy of non-intercourse. Yeah, it's just non-interference. Don't bother each other. We just trade. August the 1st, 1809, Madison persuades Albert Gallatin to remain Secretary of Treasury in the face of strong congressional opposition and discord within Madison's cabinet. February 3rd, 1810, West Florida tensions. Prompted by tensions with Spain over West Florida, Madison calls for the renewal of an act authorizing the president to call out 100,000 militiamen fill up the regular army with its authorized strength, establish a force of 20,000 volunteers for immediate emergencies, and reactivate idle components of the naval fleet. Yeah, and remember, Spain, still a big dog. They have all this territory in the Americas. So yeah, it's like, be on guard. Be ready for anything to happen. April 16th, 1810, Fletcher v. Peck. Chief Justice John Marshall overrules state legislation in Fletcher v. Peck, finding attempts to rectify the Yazoo land fraud scheme a violation of contract rights. Madison determines to add Republicans to the court. Yeah. John Marshall, one of the most powerful, earliest, influential Chief Justices. Even to this day, a lot of his influences are still seen. So, yeah. May the 1st, 1810, Macon's Bill number 2. To replace the Non-Intercourse Act, Congress passes Macon's Bill number 2, which allows American ships to carry French and English goods while barring belligerent powers from American ports. The bill further promises to renew non-intercourse with one of the two belligerent nations if the other withdraws its decrees. Trade with France and Britain is restored so long as the European nations respect American trade rights. August the 5th, 1810. The Cador Letter. The Cador Letter notifies the American minister in France that the decrees of Berlin and Milan will be repealed effective November the 1st if Britain revokes its orders in council or if the United States bars trade with Britain. So, France, again, remember, being ruled by Napoleon, he's like, look, if you promise to stop trading with them, we'll gladly remove any restrictions and stuff. October the 27th, 1810, occupation of West Florida. Madison issues a proclamation authorizing occupation of West Florida, also claimed by Spain as part of the Louisiana Purchase. The proclamation to occupy West Florida, and on October the 27th, 1810, Madison issues the proclamation that authorized the U.S. occupation of West Florida, which included land from the Perdido River west along the Gulf Coast to the Mississippi River. Yeah, what was Florida isn't just Florida today. It went across a lot of those little strips of land that are Alabama and Mississippi. But yeah, the Louisiana Purchase itself implied that West Florida might, in fact, be a part of the deal, but Jefferson pressed his claim against Spain, and much to his chagrin, in 1804, France insisted West Florida had not been part of the purchase. Spain refused to negotiate with the U.S., and its war continued between France. And as war continued between France and Britain, Spain allied with France. Well, both France and Britain harassed American shipping, and Madison speculated that Britain might capture Florida to use as a base to attack the U.S. in the event the U.S. joined the war. Then in late September, Americans in West Florida seized control of the area, proclaimed an independent republic, and offered it to the United States. Madison did not support the rebels' actions and continued to reason that West Florida already belonged to the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase. So he issued his proclamation in October to annex West Florida to prevent the territory from falling into British hands, and appointed William C.C. Claiborne governor of the Orleans territory to take control of the area. Federalist, opponent of Madison's Republican Party, claimed the occupation was unconstitutional. But Congress voted in January along party lines to approve Madison's action, and the episode raised hopes for those who wanted to annex East Florida, as the United States would eventually do so in 1819 with the Adams-Otis Treaty. I'm sure at this point, Spain's fighting alongside France during the war, the Napoleonic Wars. It didn't give much care for this little strip of land. It's like, look, it's not worth the effort. We think it's ours, but we're not going to fight because we got too much we're focusing on anyway right now. November the 2nd, 1810, Trade Wars. Under the terms of Madison's Bill number 2, or Macon's Bill number 2, Madison accepts a French offer to stop confiscation of American supplies and ships. In February of 1811, he declares a halt to end trade with Britain unless the orders are repealed. Undeterred, Britain vows to continue to seize American ships until France ends its trade restrictions. Wow. February the 2nd, 1811, non-intercourse with Britain. Madison reestablishes non-intercourse with Britain. Meanwhile, the French continue the seizure of American ships. So even though it's like, look, we're not even contacting them, France is still like, well, we still need the ships, still need the goods, still need the sailors. Really? February the 21st, 1811, presidential vetoes. Madison vetoes 2 bills of Congress. One, on the 21st, incorporating an Episcopal church in Washington, D.C., and the other on the 28th, granting land in the Mississippi Territory to a Baptist congregation. Madison argues that both bills violate the non-establishment clause of the First Amendment. That you can't sit there and favor one certain religion over another. You can't just go, hey, we like this religion, so we're giving you what we want. And Madison's like, no, you can't do that. That's against the First Amendment. March the 3rd, 1811, Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States closes. Treasury Secretary Gallatin urges Congress to extend the charter, but fails to convince members concerned with the large British interest in the bank. March the 20th, 1811, Secretary of State. After Madison dismisses Secretary of State Robert Smith, James Monroe accepts Madison's offer of the cabinet position. As we know, Monroe becomes the next president after Madison. April 16th, 1811, attitudes toward Britain. Editor Gales of the National Intelligencer prints a summary of his discussion with James Madison, and the talks indicate that Madison has hardened his attitude toward Britain. May the 16th, 1811, the battleship President. After it is attacked, the USS battleship President fires on the British ship, the HMS Little Belt. July the 2nd, 1811. Address to the people of the United States. Former Secretary of State Robert Smith publishes an address to the people of the U.S. attacking the Madison administration and revealing the disagreements within the cabinet. So it's like, you kick me out? Fine, I'll show all the conflict going on. January 6, 1811, new British Foreign Minister Foster arrives in Washington and warns Madison that if non-intercourse remains the policy of the U.S., Britain will retaliate against American commerce. July the 24th, 1811. Madison calls a special session of Congress to convene November the 4th in preparation for war against Britain. So we already see the war on the horizon. The clouds had been building, and Madison's like, look, we're going to go ahead and have to prepare for this. November the 5th, 1811, Madison delivers a tentative war message to Congress indicating his shift in policy. November the 7th, 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe. After acknowledging the danger posed by Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who hopes to assemble a confederation of tribes, General William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indian Territory, carries out a preemptive strike on Tecumseh, and his militia is barely successful at the Battle of Tippecanoe, an engagement that serves as a prelude to the War of 1812. Tecumseh flees to Canada and British protection. And on December 18th, Madison proclaims the Battle of Tippecanoe a victory that will restore peace to the northwestern frontier. And of course, William Henry Harrison gets the nickname Old Tippecanoe because of the battle, because of winning. And part of his campaign when he runs for president is Old Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because his vice president running mate is John Tyler. But that's further down the road. November the 25th, 1811. The Senate confirms James Monroe as Secretary of State to replace Robert Smith. See, back in the days of the early republic, things moved slow. We talked about the Treaty of Ghent, even though it had already been signed, having to be sailed across the U.S. Monroe finally gets confirmed by the Senate to be Secretary of State, November 25th, 1811, even though he was offered the position on March the 20th, 1811. So March the 20th, all the way down to November 25th. What, 9 months? It's the great majority of a year. November the 29th, 1811, growing the armed forces. Again, we already see the clouds of war on the horizon. Even Madison's acknowledged this, giving a speech that we need to prepare for war. So the House Committee on Foreign Relations recommends legislation to bring the Army up to full strength, establish a second regular army of 10,000, enable the President to organize 50,000 volunteers, strengthen the Navy, incorporate militia units into national service, and arm merchantmen. So, knowing that there's a likely conflict on the horizon, everything's being prepared. January the 10th, 1812, Army Bill. Congress passes an Army Bill to enlarge the second regular army to 25,000. The increase in manpower is far greater than Madison's request. He had asked for a force of 10,000, but the bill provides less flexibility than Madison had requested, and amidst disagreements between Madison's administration and Congress, modifications were made to the legislation over the summer. January the 27th, 1812, the House refuses to enlarge the Navy, even though we had a Secretary of the Navy who beforehand was like, look, we're going to have to enlarge the Navy, and Congress is like, nah, we ain't going to do it. Motherfuckers. War is coming! That's probably how they felt. Motherfuckers, war is coming! And Congress is like, no, we ain't going to pay for it. Oh, you're going to pay for it. When British comes in here and kicks our butt. March the 9th, 1812. Relations with Canada. Madison shares the letters of John Henry, agent for the Governor of Canada, with Congress, having purchased the letters the previous month for $50,000. The documents indicate the Governor-General of Canada is inciting rebellion in New England. So even Canada, who remember is still part of Britain, is trying to incite rebellion in the young nation of the U.S. March the 21st, 1812, orders in council continued. British Minister Foster tells Madison administration that the orders in council will be continued. And March the 23rd, 1812, France sinks U.S. ships. News arrives that France has sunk American ships carrying flour to British troops in Spain, leading many in Congress to call for war against France. The incident has been seen by many as proof that France has not repealed edicts against American neutral commerce. April the 2nd, 1812, Congressional embargo. Congress passes an embargo effective through July the 4th on all shipping to give shippers the opportunity to get their vessels to safe haven. April the 15th, 1812, Louisiana is admitted to the nation as the 18th state. May the 18th, 1812, amidst fierce intra-party competition, Madison is nominated by the Democratic Republicans for a second term as president. So yeah, it's coming up at the end of the year, the election period for the next president. So Madison, even though there's conflict within the Democratic-Republican Party to keep him on, he manages to get the nod, and of course we know he does win. May the 23rd, 1812, Madison sees the letter from Lord Castlereagh to the British Minister Foster confirming the continuance of the orders in council, and the president begins drafting his war message to Congress. June the 1st, 1812. Madison delivers the message to Congress justifying the war against Britain and asking for a declaration of war. On June the 4th, the House of Representatives votes 79 to 49 in favor of the war against Britain. On June the 16th, Britain revokes its orders in council in an attempt to avoid war with the U.S., but news of the British decision will reach the U.S. too late. And on June the 17th, the Senate votes 1913 for a declaration of war. So yeah, Britain is like, look, we're finally going to go ahead and get rid of this. But as you saw, it takes forever, as we've already discussed, it takes forever for anything to go across the U.S., or go across the ocean, I should say, from Europe to the U.S. And yeah, the news of the revocation of the orders in council arrives too late to prevent the war. June the 18th, 1812, Madison issues a declaration of war against Britain. So yeah, he issues the war on the 18th. Britain revokes the orders in council on the 16th. So the messages are crisscrossing. Oh my goodness. Ah! In addition to concern over British actions with regard to international trade, some proponents of the war also endorse territorial expansion into British Canada and Spanish Florida, and also hope to end suspected British support of Native American Indian attacks. Without the Bank of America and with an army of only 6,700, the U.S. faces dire economic and military straits at the war's outset. The U.S. Navy, with a fleet of only 16 vessels, delivers the nation's only victories in the first year of war. So yeah, first real war we're fighting since the Revolution. Our forces are greatly diminished. Yeah. June 22nd, 1812, General Henry Dearborn, commanding American forces in Canada, requests that all New England governors cap the size of militias guarding the respective coast and frontiers. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island refuse. June 23, 1812, the end of orders in council. British Foreign Secretary announces the end of the orders in council. The agreement comes too late, however, as Madison requested a declaration of war against Britain on June the 1st. August the 8th, 1812, armistice with Lower Canada. Dearborn signs an armistice with the governor of Lower Canada. Madison repudiates it the following week, and Dearborn terminates the armistice on August the 25th. August the 11th, 1812, the surrender of Detroit. Michigan Governor and General William Hull, in charge of the American offensive from Detroit into Upper Canada, gives his attack on Fort Malden, or gives up his attack on Fort Malden and surrenders Detroit to British forces on August the 16th without firing a shot. November the 1st, 1812, Madison is re-elected. Despite fierce competition and conflict within the Democrat-Republican Party, Madison wins re-election. We get a new Secretary of Navy, January 1st, 1813, with William Jones. New Secretary of War on January the 14th, 1813, with John Armstrong. Winchester's Battle on January the 18th, 1813. As Americans throughout the Northwest are enraged by Winchester's battle and surrender at Frenchtown and the Wyandotte murder of 60 Kentucky prisoners of war, the Northwest ceases to play a role in the war strategy. And remember, the Northwest at this time, the Ohio Valley, your Ohio's, Michigan's, Illinois, Indiana, that area is the Northwest. April 21st, 1813, Albert Gallatin and James A. Bayard leave to join John Quincy Adams in St. Petersburg for peace negotiations sponsored by Russia. May the 31st, 1813, Quincy Adams, James A. Bayard, and Albert Gallatin are nominated as representatives to the peace negotiations, but the Senate rejects Gallatin on July the 19th. Gallatin is eventually confirmed after the Senate forces Madison to declare Gallatin's Treasury Cabinet post vacant. September the 10th, 1813, Battle of Put-in Bay. Impressive display of valor, Captain Oliver Perry wins control of Lake Erie in the Battle of Put-in Bay for 4 hours. Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, receives heavy attacks from 2 British warships, leaving most of his crew dead or wounded. Instead of surrendering, however, Perry rows to another ship and launches an attack on the British, finally accepting surrender of the entire British fleet. Perry sends word to General Harrison stating, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Yeah, remember, Lake Erie, part of the Great Lakes, so it's inland. We're talking about the lakes, the 5 Great Lakes which border the U.S. and Canada. So that's where we're seeing the battles, these naval battles. October the 5th, 1813, the Battle of Thames. U.S. under General Harrison emerges victorious at the Battle of the Thames. I'm not sure. The most important American victory to date, as it ends British and Indian control in the Northwest and Upper Canada. Tecumseh would die in the battle. So, apparently named after, I'm sure, the Thames River in England. So, December the 9th, 1813, Madison calls for total embargo on exports and a ban on all imports of British origin, believing that Britain depends on trade with the U.S. Congress passes the embargo just days later. January the 28th, 1814, James Jackson of Virginia introduces a constitutional amendment in the House authorizing the establishment of a national bank, but Congress postpones consideration. February the 1st, 1814, Madison appoints Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, James Bayard, Jonathan Russell and John Quincy Adams as commissioners to negotiate directly with Britain in Gothenburg, Sweden. These negotiations are later transferred to Ghent, Belgium, which we know the Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812. February the 9th, 1814, Campbell appointed Secretary of Treasury to replace Gallatin. March 3rd, 1814, Congress authorizes the borrowing of $25 million to finance war costs from the War of 1812. March the 27th, 1814, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Under the command of Andrew Jackson, 2,000 troops defeat the Creek Confederation at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in the Tallapoosa River, eliminating the Confederation as an obstacle to American expansion toward the Gulf Coast. The engagement is one of the most significant American victories in the War of 1812, providing the U.S. with two-thirds of Creek land in the Treaty of Fort Jackson. March the 31st, 1814, Napoleon's European empire finally collapses. So we see the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's European empire collapses. Learning of Napoleon's defeat, Madison calls for the immediate repeal of the trade embargo with neutral nations, signaling a major reassessment of American war aims and strategy. He signs the bill into law on April 14th. The British, meanwhile, can now turn their complete attention to war with the U.S. So, yeah, the Napoleonic Wars had been affecting the U.S. so much, and now it's like, finally, we could do something now that those stupid wars in Europe that have been interfering with us trying to exist as a nation, we can finally say, hey, we're done. No more of the embargo, we can trade. May the 11th, 1814, Andrew Jackson becomes Major General as William Henry Harrison resigns as Major General. June the 7th, 1814, the invasion of Canada. Madison and his cabinet decide to continue with the attempted invasion of Canada. July the 1st, 1814, Special Military District established. Madison convenes his cabinet to establish a special military district for the protection of Washington and Baltimore, placing it under the command of Brigadier General William Winder. July the 27th, 1814, the Battle of the Burnt Corn in the Mississippi Territory brings Creek Indians into the war against the U.S. August the 24th, 1814, the British burn Washington. We talked quite a bit about that, yeah. On August the 24th, 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops invaded D.C. and set the White House, the Capitol, and other federal buildings on fire. The city had been evacuated before the British arrived, with President James Madison and his administration leaving the capital city to flee the invading soldiers. During the war, American and British troops clashed up and down the East Coast from Canada down to New Orleans, and the war began after President Madison requested a declaration of war from Congress to protect American ships on the open seas and to try to stop the British practice of impressments, the seizure of U.S. soldiers for service in Britain's Navy. The first years would prove disastrous for the U.S., and by the fall of 1812, British had defeated American forces in Detroit and western New York. In fact, much of the Northwest Territory had fallen to the British. Americans began to have military success in the spring of 1813. when the U.S. Navy defeated the British fleet on Lake Erie and U.S. forces attacked the Canadian capital in York. The U.S. also won significant battles against Native Americans in Ontario and the Mississippi Territory. Events swung back against the Americans in the late spring of 1814 as the British went on the offensive and raided American ports from Georgia to Maine. After they landed in the Chesapeake, they began to move towards Washington, D.C. They encountered little resistance along the way. Monroe, who had served as Madison's Secretary of State in Defense, led a scouting party to report on the British advance. He sent word to Madison that the British were marching towards D.C., and Madison and other government officials left the city for the countryside. First Lady Dolly Madison resisted the calls to evacuate. When she finally left, the famous incident, she made sure that a portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart was removed from the White House and stored safely. She also took several important cabinet documents with her when she departed. As the British troops headed to the capital, Monroe stayed to help with the city's evacuation. Once the British entered the city, they torched the White House and most other federal buildings in retaliation for the burning of the Canadian Parliament buildings in York. The U.S. was ultimately victorious in the War of 1812. Like I said, though, we got our butts handed to us. And the Treaty of Ghent was signed by both countries in December 1814. Washington, D.C. was gradually rebuilt. It took 3 years to rebuild the White House, and in October 1817, then President Monroe moved back into the reconstructed White House. So, yeah. September 14th, 1814, following the sack of D.C., U.S. General Samuel Smith turns back a British attack on Fort Henry at Baltimore. After the unsuccessful British offensive, Francis Scott Key pins the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say, can you see? Yeah, that's when that's written. September the 27th, 1814, James Monroe appointed Secretary of War by Madison, and Monroe will serve as Secretary of both War and State until the end of the war. October 5th, 1814, Alexander J. Dallas appointed Secretary of Treasury, replacing George W. Campbell. October 18th, 1814, the Convention of New England States, Massachusetts General Court calls a convention of New England states whose livelihood depends largely on international trade to coordinate regional grievances with the federal government. From December the 15th through January the 5th, delegates from some New England states meet in Hartford, Connecticut to discuss grievances against the federal government and to provide alternative solutions to talk of secession among New England radicals. Yeah, the threat of splitting apart was always huge in the early U.S. November the 7th, 1814, Andrew Jackson takes Pensacola, Florida. And December the 15th, 1814, Hartford Convention issues condemnation condemning the federal government for failing to defend New England. The report recommends the state negotiate arrangement with the federal government for their defense and proposes constitutional amendments to protect the region's increasingly minority status in the Union. Following news of Jackson's victory at New Orleans, the U.S. public condemns the Hartford Convention as anti-American, and the Federalist Party suffers as a result. December the 24th, 1814, the U.S. and Britain signed the Treaty of Ghent, and again, it'll take it a couple months to reach the U.S., February of 1815. January 7th, 1815, Bank Bill vetoed. House of U.S. Representatives passes the amended Bank Bill as a compromise between Federalists and the anti-bank Republicans, but it is nevertheless unsatisfactory to Madison and Secretary of Treasury Dallas. Madison vetoes the bill. January 8, 1815, Battle of New Orleans. Jackson, leading 4,000 militiamen, citizens, and regular soldiers, wins a resounding victory over 6,000 British forces in the Battle of New Orleans. Many of Jackson's troops are volunteers, among them free blacks and slaves. There are just a dozen American casualties to 2,000 British casualties. Jackson's victory, along with the success against the Creeks, make him a national hero. So you can see where he's starting to get a lot of his notoriety from, nationally. January the 27th, 1815, Madison signs a bill allowing the president to call up 40,000 state troops. Congress has limited the bill, however, by authorizing troops to serve only in their home states with the consent of state governors. February 13th, 1815, the end of the War of 1812. May the 10th, 1815, War on Algiers. So we finally get the treaty in the U.S., Senate ratifies it in February, and it's May, we have a war on Algiers. Madison, having secured a declaration of war on Algiers, Captain Stephen Decatur leads a flotilla from New York against the Mediterranean pirates who attack American ships during the War of 1812. Though this war is much quicker, Algiers surrendering on June the 30th. June the 1st, 1815, convention with Britain. Gallatin negotiates a commercial convention with Britain, further signifying the potential for the U.S. to play an important role in the international trade and industrialization. December the 1st, 1815, Madison's seventh message to Congress. Madison presents his seventh annual message to Congress advocating military streamlining, a new national bank, protective tariffs to promote industry, and international improvements. And the key is protective tariffs, not what the idiot in charge right now has done with his tariffs. April the 10th, 1816, rechartering a national bank. Madison signs a bill rechartering a new national bank in Philadelphia. The charter is set for a 21-year term. April 19th, 1816, Indiana becomes a state. And finally, November the 1st, 1816, Monroe is elected president. December the 3rd, 1816, Madison's eighth and final message to Congress. Delivering his eighth annual address to Congress, he calls for vigilance in foreign affairs, internal improvements, and restructuring of the judiciary and executive offices. And as a bonus, March the 3rd, 1817, bonus bill vetoes. On his last day in office, Madison vetoes Representative Henry Clay's bonus bill for internal improvements. But yeah, that's the list, much more detailed list of key events that happened during the Madison presidency that would impact the U.S. And finally, let's read this from the Miller Center, Madison's Impact and Legacy. Americans and scholars will likely regard Madison as a better convention and congressional leader than president. Those roles played to Madison's strengths, where deep thought and intimate persuasion are more prized than charisma and magnetism. Indeed, given Madison's affinity for congressional over presidential power, that legacy would probably suit him fine. His small frame, I think he was only 5'4", soft voice and dislike of attention hardly made him a natural in the office of president. For those reasons, Dolly was an indispensable partner in the White House, recognizing that the nation craved presidential splendor that Madison hesitated to supply. That hesitance stemmed partly from his personality and partly from his deep-rooted desire that the presidential office maintain a Republican simplicity even as the nation grew and developed. Assessments of Madison's presidency usually hinge on the assessments of the War of 1812. The causes and aims of the war today still seem undefined, and the outcome of the war seems equally murky. Now, like I said, while some people may say technically we won, you got to remember we got our butt handed to us quite a bit too. It was a war where, yeah, we had some good points, but we got our asses kicked at times. Some such ambiguity raises doubts about the wisdom of prosecuting the war in the first place. The war was highly popular in most parts of the nation, but hardly universally so. A nation whose Senate takes 2 weeks to debate a declaration of war is a nation unsure of its commitment to the cause. The war also invited the only successful invasion and sacking of Washington, D.C., hardly a glowing distinction. Many historians will see wartime Madison much like the British and Federalists did at the time, a panicky figure fleeing from the flames set by the British. Despite the negative perception that persists, some historians have recently rethought Madison's wartime accomplishments, even drawing comparisons to Abraham Lincoln. Bereft of effective generals, Madison took a direct interest in the prosecution of the war. He refused to relinquish the details to Secretary of War John Armstrong, though it can be tempting to dismiss the caliber of U.S. fighting. The U.S. did withstand a British invasion at a time when the British would gladly have at least retaken some territory in North America. Unlike during the Revolutionary War, the U.S. fought Britain without the aid of foreign allies, without the aid of foreign teaching, foreign money, foreign weapons. Revolutionary War, France economically aided us. Former Prussian General Baron von Steuben taught our military how to drill their soldiers, how to teach them to fight. We had so much help in that Revolutionary War. War of 1812, we did not have that help. Napoleon distracted the British during the first part of the war, but his defeat early 1814 freed British forces to concentrate on America. A crucial U.S. naval victory that threatened British supply lines forced the retreat of a formidable British force that could have otherwise inflicted serious damage. In the most sympathetic reading of events, Madison prosecuted a respectable war that vindicated U.S. sovereignty and international rights. The war introduced the nation onto the world stage as a respected power for the first time in its short history. So yeah, we win our independence in the Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812, it can kind of be seen as a loss, kind of be seen as a win, because again, we had our strong points, but there were a lot of times when we just got our butts handed to us. But we did survive this second military conflict, and thus we were on the international world stage as a young growing power. Like other enslavers among the founding fathers, Madison's legacy will always grapple with slavery because of his enslavement of others and because of the protections of the Constitution afforded the institution of slavery. Remember, Three-Fifths Compromise. And we're shortly to have a whole lot of issues going on. The Missouri Compromise and all this. It's just coming down the road. And yeah, we know how it finally results, but when something could have been done to help end this, it's like, no, it'll work itself out. You could have done something stronger against it. Like others of his generation, he considered slavery evil, but spent little time or political capital laboring to extricate it from his own life or from the United States. Yeah. Many of your founding fathers saw slavery as an evil, but they were very, very hesitant to do anything some might have saw as too drastic, because it was still a huge part of economic power in the U.S. And unfortunately, it's one of the failings. You kind of have to look at the founding fathers and go, guys, you could have done more in this regard. Madison's complicity with slavery is less visible than Jefferson's, who made equality a founding idea in the Declaration of Independence, but it is naughtier than Washington's, who labored to keep his estate solvent so he could free the enslaved people at Mount Vernon at his will, though Washington died at a time when the process was easier legally, politically, and financially. Madison's legacy remains intrinsically linked with U.S. constitutionalism. By the time delegates at the Constitutional Convention signed the document of September the 17th, 1787, it looked rather different from Madison's original proposals. Those changes have caused some of the question whether Americans should remember him as the father of the Constitution. Some have wondered if that title might even belong to George Washington, given his eminence at the convention and the legitimacy that his presence lent the charter. However, Americans choose to remember the founders with such titles of doubtful historical usefulness. It is difficult to overstate Madison's contributions to the U.S. Constitution. He tirelessly advocated the convention helped convince Washington to attend and provided an initial imprint for the government, spoke frequently and persuasively in debates, kept invaluable notes of the proceedings, fought for ratification, and authored the Bill of Rights. In the process, he produced a biting constitutional theory for generations of political theorists, Supreme Court opinions, and common Americans. Theories and ideas that right now the Republican Party and the shit staying in office don't give a damn about. They have taken a complete dump after setting the Constitution on fire on our founding document. Anyway, much like Jefferson's tied with the writing of the Declaration of Independence, even though he did not technically write that alone, Madison is similarly tied with the Constitution, even though he did not write that alone. Most people know that James Madison left a legacy of constitutionalism in the U.S., but he did more than that. He insisted that 13 sovereign independent states scrap their diplomatic assembly and unite into a nation. Because remember, beforehand we were the Confederation under the Articles of Confederation. And Madison's like, look, this Constitution makes things much easier. Certainly he was one among many who advocated such a path, but he combined his advocacy with uniquely laborious thought, planning, and action to bring it into fruition. Madison was instrumental in creating not just a constitution for a nation, but for the nation itself. Washington was the gravitational pull that kept a centrifugal nation together, but Madison may have done more actually to sire that nation out of individual states. At a time when some are wondering if George Washington is the real father of the Constitution, it is worth wondering if James Madison is the real father of the nation. And again, these first 5 presidents, these men were instrumental in the U.S. And Madison, being that 4th president, part of this founding father quintuplet, yeah, he did so much to make the U.S. better. But this video already being freaking long as hell, we'll go ahead and end it here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite those sources, and it can't be tinfoil hat wearing sources or a bunch of anecdotes thrown together to try to make sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.